This is the Chapter 3 Stigma Podcast. This podcast was created to be there for any individual who feels like they are at a low point in life and are confused, seemingly alone, and helpless in their situation. I am a recovering alcoholic, and I felt this way too, until I sat across the table from another addict who shared his story and made me realize that I was not alone in my struggles. My life was saved by this realization, and I hope to help anyone struggling by sharing my story to show you that you are not alone and that life can contain unbelievable riches and meaning. Welcome. I am glad you are here. Hey folks, welcome to another episode of the Chapter 3 Stigma Podcast. We are going to continue working through Chapter 3 of the Alcoholics Anonymous book titled More About Alcoholism. So, right to the book. Many of us felt that we had plenty of character. There was a tremendous urge to cease forever, yet we found it impossible. This is the baffling feature of alcoholism as we know it. This utter inability to leave it alone, no matter how great the necessity or the wish. How then shall we help our readers determine to their own satisfaction whether they are one of us? The experiment of quitting for a period of time will be helpful. And I'll just pause. This is in reference to the proposed experiment of quitting drinking for a year. But we think, back to the book, but we think we can render an even greater service to alcoholic sufferers and perhaps to the medical fraternity. So we shall describe some of the mental states that precede a relapse into drinking, for obviously this is the crux of the problem. What sort of thinking dominates an alcoholic who repeats time after time the desperate experiment of the first drink? Friends who have reasoned with him after a spree which has brought him to the point of divorce or bankruptcy, are mystified when he walks directly into a saloon. Why does he do it? Of what is he thinking? And I'm just going to pause here and go back to this call out of the desperate experiment of the first drink. And the best way to know and to measure if you are conducting an experiment of this type is this. Ask yourself, how often have you, before drinking, had this thought run through your head? This time will be different. I know many people in the recovery community who had that thought run through their head. I know in my own personal experience, this was the thought that always, every single time, 100% of the time, preceded me entering into another bender or days of drinking. So back to the book. Our first example is a friend we shall call Jim. This man has a charming wife and family. He inherited a lucrative automobile agency. He had a commendable World War record. He is a good salesman. Everybody likes him. He is an intelligent man, normal so far as we can see, except for a nervous disposition. He did no drinking until he was 35. In a few years, he became so violent when intoxicated that he had to be committed. On leaving the asylum, he came into contact with us. We told him what we knew of alcoholism and the answer we had found. He made a beginning. His family was reassembled, and he began to work as a salesman for the business he had lost through drinking. All went well for a time, but he failed to enlarge his spiritual life. To his consternation, he found himself drunk half a dozen times in rapid succession. On each of these occasions, we worked with him, reviewing carefully what had happened. He agreed he was a real alcoholic and in a serious condition. He knew he faced another trip to the asylum if he kept on. Moreover, he would lose his family for whom he had a deep affection. Yet, he got drunk again. We asked him to tell us exactly how it happened. This is his story. I came to work on Tuesday morning. I remember I felt irritated that I had to be a salesman for a concern I once owned. I had a few words with the boss, but nothing serious. Then I decided to drive into the country and see one of my prospects for a car. On the way, I felt hungry, so I stopped at a roadside place where they have a bar. I had no intention of drinking. I just thought I would get a sandwich. I also had the notion that I might find a customer for a car at this place, which was familiar, for I had been going to it for years. I had eaten there many times during the months I was sober. I sat down at a table and ordered a sandwich and a glass of milk. Still no thought of drinking. I ordered another sandwich and decided to have another glass of milk. I'm going to pause here before going further into this story. And I just want to point out a couple items that stand out to me. Again, the lack of intention to drink in this scenario. Again, it was often something that occurred to me where it's like there would be no plan, no reasoning to go out and buy alcohol and start drinking, and yet something would crop up, and that something generally was in the form of a really quite pathetic excuse. And so in the case of this story, the item that I have highlighted here and just find in an odd way funny, because I know the frame of mind that this individual was in when he decided to take the actions that he did. He decides to go into this place to eat that had a bar because, quote, I also had the notion that I might find a customer for a car at this place. It's just like such a pathetic excuse for exposing yourself to a situation that, in this gentleman's case, presented real risk. And it's just like you reason with yourself, and in your reasoning, you layer on these like really, really petty and really stupid and nonsensical excuses. And so in this person's instance, it's like he gave himself the opening to go in because it's like, well, there's a far off chance I could make a sale here, and I'm a salesman, so I better do it. And just like thinking back on my own time, just the ridiculous excuses. And I'm actually going to get to it a little later in this podcast. But again, I really want to call out this and highlight this just like meaningless and baseless excuse that winds up entering into the story and the thought pattern of someone right before they enter into a bender. So back to the book. Suddenly, the thought crossed my mind that if I were to put an ounce of whiskey in my milk, it couldn't hurt me on a full stomach. I ordered a whiskey and poured it into the milk. I vaguely sensed I was not being any too smart, but felt reassured as I was taking the whiskey on a full stomach. The experiment went so well, I ordered another whiskey and poured it into more milk. That didn't seem to bother me, so I tried another. And I'll just pause there again. And this statement about vaguely sensing I was not being any too smart. Every time I entered back into a drinking spell or drinking spree, I guess, I knew right away, like as I was starting, that things weren't going to end well. Despite telling myself and making the excuse that, well, this time will be different. I'll monitor myself. I'll make sure I stop. In the back of my head, I knew that was not going to be the case. And again, just like the rapid expansion and exposure to risk that occurs with an alcoholic, honestly, after that first drink. So in this case, he said, the experiment went so well that I ordered another whiskey. I've described it before, but the rapid hijacking and taking over of your thought patterns and your system that alcohol had when it did wind up hitting my system, it was just like I couldn't have enough. And I really can't explain it, but it's just, there would be this 4 to 5 second moment of relief and calm as I felt, the alcohol kind of coursing through my system. And then my mind just went into overdrive mode and started thinking and started planning and started figuring out how to manipulate the situation or the scenario so that I could get more. And the personal excuses started cascading and coming to mind about, why I could drink more this time. And again, why it would be different. And I won't get out of control this time. And I'll stop just after today. And it's just this once. And it was never contained. And those excuses and that reasoning that I did with myself never actually came into fruition, because when it comes down to it, I can't control it. So anyway, it's hard. Obviously, decades separate myself and my own situation from this gentleman's and his story. But when you are an alcoholic and when you read these words and know what is going on behind the scenes, like under the hood, and just those chaotic and very difficult to describe and psychotic thought patterns, it's tough. It's tough sitting here or being here today and like thinking back to it, because it's so weak. And I have a lot of forgiveness and like a genuine sense of love and caring and affection for myself back then. But I wish so badly that I could have just called the excuse an excuse at what it was. So anyway, back to the book. Thus started one more journey to the asylum for Jim. Here was the threat of commitment, the loss of family and position, to say nothing of that intense mental and physical suffering which drinking always caused him. He had much knowledge about himself as an alcoholic, yet all reasons for not drinking were easily pushed aside in favor of the foolish idea that he could take whiskey if only he mixed it with milk. And I'll pause there just to circle back on the knowledge portion. Again, I have talked about the self-seeking and the self-knowledge that I pursued with regards to habit creation, establishing routines, understanding the mechanisms of addiction, understanding how alcohol impacts and affects the physiology. And despite all of this self-knowledge that I had, I was never able to stop, and it didn't help me. And I think that is quite possibly one of the biggest risks of an alcoholic, especially someone who has like a more capability to like solve problems themselves than others. And I'm not saying that I fall into that camp, but there's a lot of knowledge that you can gather about the world, about different systems, and really as an individual, like you can almost pick up any skill that you really want to at this point, just given the vast amount of knowledge that's available at every one of our fingertips. But the difficult, frustrating, and just aspect of alcoholism that drove me nuts was self-knowledge is going to get you nowhere if you truly are an alcoholic. So, I would say take some time, reflect on your own personal journey, and look and see if you have been seeking that knowledge to kind of like unlock the solution for yourself. And just, I guess, I hope you hear me, that it's like, if you are an alcoholic, no amount of self-knowledge, of understanding the mechanisms behind alcoholism and its effects on the body are going to cure you. So back to the book. Whatever the precise definition of the word may be, we call this plain insanity. How can such a lack of proportion, of the ability to think straight, be called anything else? You may think this an extreme case. To us, it is not far-fetched, for this kind of thinking has been characteristic of every single one of us. We have sometimes reflected more than Jim did upon the consequences, but there was always the curious mental phenomenon that, parallel with our sound reasoning, there inevitably ran some insanely trivial excuse for taking the first drink. Our sound reasoning failed to hold us in check. The insane idea won out. Next day, we would ask ourselves, in all earnestness and sincerity, how it could have happened. And so I'm going to pause here and I just took like 10 seconds and wrote out a variety of excuses that I genuinely used when I was drinking. And the way that I want to portray these is they cover both extremes and both ends of the spectrum of the scenario that I built my excuse around. So here's what I mean by that. I have used as an excuse to allow myself to drink that I worked out. Hey, I worked hard. I deserved it. I'm gonna drink. It'll be different this time. I'm just gonna have a little. Like, why would I want to ruin my workout? I have also used, I didn't work out. I feel like shit. Well, I'm feeling like shit anyway, so I'm just gonna add alcohol to the mix. I have used as an excuse, I have so much to do. I feel overwhelmed. I think this permits me to have a drink and relax. And then maybe once I'm relaxed, I will be able to get this, all the laundry list of things I have to do. I'll be able to get it done. Conversely, I have used the excuse, I have nothing to do. I have nothing but free time, and I have the ability to kick back and relax. And so I'm going to drink. I've used the excuse, I am so stressed. I just need to get alcohol so that my anxiety goes down and my racing heart, my rapid breath, all of that just kind of gets put in line. Conversely, I have used, I am just so relaxed and unwinding now that a drink would just fit the bill perfectly right now. Every single one of those I have used time and time again, and a whole list more for reasons to allow myself to drink, knowing full well that things were not going to end the way that I planned or the way that I wanted. And then, as the book says, the next day I would wake up, and oftentimes, in all honesty, it wasn't even the next, I guess technically it was the next day, but it was like 2 a.m. in the morning, just laying in bed, wide awake, detoxing from the evening or the day before, wondering what the hell happened. How could I find myself here again? And there were times that I would genuinely wake up, not really remember or not really know where I was, what was going on, and realize that I had lost myself on a bender, and I would cry out loud. I was so frustrated and so upset that I found myself in this situation again, and that this had happened again. Now back to the book. In some circumstances, we have gone out deliberately to get drunk, feeling ourselves justified by nervousness, anger, worry, depression, jealousy, or the like. But even in this type of beginning, we are obliged to admit that our justification for a spree was insanely insufficient in the light of what always happened. We now see that when we began to drink deliberately instead of casually, there was little serious or effective thought during the period of premeditation of what the terrific consequences might be. So I'm just going to pause there to kind of let that sink in. It's like really measuring and weighing out the risk that I was taking every time that I drank and the known end result. Obviously, you can't predict the future, but by the end, things were so patterned and I knew how they would play out that I knew what I was signing up for when I decided and made the excuse and reasoned myself into believing that I could drink again. And if I would have written out those risks that I was taking, coupled with basically what I was going to have to pay in the future in terms of how I felt physically, where I was emotionally, what it meant with regards to working on Alyssa in my relationship. Because every time this happened, it's like we had to sit down, we had to talk about it. And I knew I was going to pay for those items in the future. Yet every time I made my way back and justified based on my excuses to drink. And it is, as the book says, just absolute insanity. And so I think this is actually a pretty good stopping point. We'll pick up on this in next week's podcast. As again, I'm very, very pleased that we finally made it to the namesake of this whole body of work, because again, the purpose and intention behind chapter 3 in the Alcoholics Anonymous book is really just to allow someone to hold a mirror up to themselves, to their lives, and look at their own thought patterns, excuses, reasons that they use to continually go back. And in my case, the first time reading through it, what I realized and what I took away from it was it's okay. It's okay to feel this way. It's okay to have these thought patterns. You are not alone in this. It is insanity. There is no doubt about that, but you're not the only one that goes through this. And as someone who struggled in the darkness alone for so many years, this was incredibly encouraging and inspired a lot of hope. And that's really my desire with going through this book and trying as best I can to overlay some of the aspects of my story onto this all. So, as always, I hope you're continuing to get something out of this podcast. I don't know if this podcast is necessarily something to enjoy, but I hope it's meaningful. And I know from my perspective, it's been incredibly powerful and meaningful to hear from you all every once in a while. Someone will reach out in a very powerful and personal way. And those types of interactions and moments, those keep me going, because really at the end of the day, where I am in life, both in my recovery journey and just in my personal journey of continued growth, I've come to realize that all of this work that I've done and I'm putting into the Chapter 3 Stigma podcast, if it helps a single person, then it is worth doing. And so I appreciate all of you. Love you all. That's all I've got. If you enjoyed this podcast, share it with others or give us a rating on your channel of choice. My hope is that my story can help others in their struggles with addiction or any other aspects of life that they feel could be bettered. You can follow us on social media at Chapter 3 Stigma on Instagram and YouTube. I cannot solve your problems for you, but I can listen. If you want to reach out with a message through one of those channels, I will respond and let you know that you are not alone. All the best, you are loved, and life is worth every struggle and bit of suffering you have to endure. Until next time.